Late autumn 1944. On maps, the Allied lines were moving with steady, painful geometry. In the fields reclaimed from battle, there were still small human problems that no advance on a chart could immediately solve. Victory, for all its momentum, arrived with the same messy logistics that always follow armies. Tents, trucks, ration cards, and places built overnight to hold men and women until paper, orders, and transportation caught up. In one such temporary compound, the paradox of triumph and neglect played out in a single simple complaint. We cannot sleep. The camp sat on a scraped field ringed with barbed wire and unfinished guard towers. Low wooden barracks, thrown up quickly on nails and borrowed lumber, leaned a little against the wind. Inside, bunks were stacked 3 high, mattresses thin as promise, and blankets that smelled faintly of canvas and damp. Lamps were left on through the night, small low-security fixtures placed for convenience or to ward off imagined daring escapes, but their constant glow erased the hard, dark line between day and night. A thin hum threaded everything, the quiet buzz of generators, the distant shuffle of boots, the creak of boards settling under 100 bodies. It was not a scene of shock in the dramatic sense. It was the everyday arithmetic of late-war camps where small things accumulated into relentless disturbance. At roll call one evening, a young American corporal moving down the ranks noticed more than the number on the list. He watched women sway, blink against the glare, their faces drawn, not solely from hunger or fear, but from an exhaustion that had a single, steady root. At the end of the line, an older woman, speaking in broken English, answered in a plain, almost practical voice, "We cannot sleep." The sentence landed in the cold air and, because it was so simple, began to make the problem legible. One of the camp's interpreters, a German-American sergeant from Ohio, took that complaint seriously in the way a translator can sometimes make pain audible. He sat with groups of women while the generators coughed and the lamps kept their low pulse. Listening, he began to assemble a pattern out of the small things. The constant, low-level light that never permitted full darkness. The chorus of small noises that any sleeping place would eventually tolerate, but here found no relief from. The rustle of canvas, a coughing fit, a board popping as its nail worked loose, boots on the night dirt. More than a catalog of discomfort, the interpreter heard the shape of a physiological complaint. Sleep, it turned out, had been driven from the camp not by a single violent act but by 1,000 small, remorseless interruptions. The camp major, a man who had spent years in theaters like North Africa and Italy, did not answer with rhetoric. He walked the lines at night with a measured step, not as a theatrical inspection but as a listening. He crouched near bunks and let the space speak to him. The way light pooled beneath a door, the rhythm of the generator, the size and slowness of footsteps on wooden planks. He watched the women sleep, or not sleep, and observed their faces in the dim. From those quiet observations he framed a diagnosis that was more practical than moral. This was a logistical failure with immediate human consequence. It could be improved without fanfare. Action, when it came, was administrative and small. That is where its power lay. The major ordered a set of measures aimed at restoring the basic conditions needed for rest. Blackout curtains and shielded lamps went up to reduce the constant, low-level illumination. Extra canvas and blankets were issued to line and pad the bunks, softening the rattling boards that acted like little alarms. Vehicle movement was curtailed after 10 in the evening except for urgent duty, and guards were instructed to wear quieter footwear during night rounds so that steps would not announce themselves across the barracks. Perhaps the most human of the changes was organizational. A rotating night order among the women themselves, so that 1 or 2 could take responsibility for minor disturbances and communicate quietly to guards when something needed attention, rather than letting 100 small irritations multiply into communal wakefulness. None of these fixes required a moral proclamation or a dramatic show of compassion. They were pragmatic steps taken by people who recognized that to win a war, or to manage its consequences, one needed to tend to the ordinary. Practical measures, when applied with consistency, had immediate effects. Within a few nights, the first shift in the camp's atmosphere became visible. Faces that had been hollowed by chronic sleeplessness softened. A ragged line of complaints about noise dwindled to an occasional murmur. The camp, which had carried the tense energy of a temporary holding place, began to feel more like a place where time slowed enough for bodies to recover. Guards noticed it too. An American private who later described the camp in a letter home remarked that it felt less like a holding pen after nights grew quieter and the lamps were shaded. There is a quiet surprise in that observation. When people think of power in wartime, they imagine force and strictures, fences and orders. But power in the field also showed itself as the capacity to relent, to make small institutional adjustments that restored a minimal dignity. The complaint "we cannot sleep" was a demand for a form of stewardship as much as it was a plea for relief. It asked that someone in authority listen and then do the simple things that lay within their power. That an interpreter translated the need, and a major translated the listening into action, tells us something about how occupying authority was occasionally exercised, not only in punishment, but in practical remedy. The technical detail of the remedies mattered precisely because they were technical. Darkness is not merely a poetic absence, it is a physiological cue. The presence of constant light interrupts circadian rhythms, suppresses the sleep hormone that helps bodies close down, and makes the restorative cycles of rest impossible. A generator hum may seem small, but for 100 restless bodies, it became a continuous arousal signal. Scraping the list of disturbances down to their mechanical causes turned the problem from an unnameable malaise into a set of solvable issues. The solutions did not apologize for the war, nor did they erase the fact of captivity. What they did was restore a measure of bodily normalcy. This was not a story of sweeping benevolence. The women in that camp were not memorialized by a parade of miracles. They were reclaimed by a series of modest administrative acts. In those small details lies the human part of the narrative. A curtain tied across a window, a strip of extra canvas nailed under a mattress to stop it from sliding, an order to defer vehicle movement until morning. These are not cinematic, but they are transformative in the quiet language of daily life. The interpreter's patient listening, the major's methodical inspection, the corporal's attentive eye, and the private's later letter are all pieces of a modest moral economy in which care was enacted through competence. There was also a political and symbolic dimension. By late 1944, the Allies were the ascending force in Western Europe. That shift in power allowed different kinds of control to be exercised. Where an occupying force had once been purely punitive or simply hurried, victory permitted administrative attentiveness. The ability to make life marginally better for prisoners, through non-sentimental pragmatic changes, was itself a sign of changing capacity. It is important not to romanticize this. These were temporary measures within the larger machinery of war. Yet they mattered to the people who slept as a result. The women remembered the episode not because of a grand declaration, but because of the workaday relief of finally being able to sleep. Memory often keeps the small incidents that altered ordinary experience. The night the lamps were dimmed, the morning the bunks no longer squeaked like alarms, the change in the rhythm of footsteps between midnight and dawn. They recalled, more often than any official report would record, the way a practical listening had made it possible to close their eyes. The phrase "we cannot sleep" circulated later not as a mark of shame, but as a turning point, the hinge on which a small but meaningful change turned. That is why the story feels, in its modesty, unbelievable to some. Not because it presents a dramatic rescue, but because it reveals that the administration of care in wartime can be as consequential as a battle. It shifts our attention from grand narratives to the human scale, the way logistics, policies, and small acts of attentiveness shape daily life. Historians sometimes look for decisive moments and forget that quiet interventions can carry profound moral and practical weight. This incident is such a moment. To be clear, this account is one of the lesser-known episodes pulled from the broader context of Allied POW compounds in late 1944. The record of wartime administration is full of comparable small stories that reveal the texture of occupation and captivity, but compiling a series of these accounts requires careful archival work beyond this single vignette. If producers or researchers want more episodes like this, additional documented instances where minor adjustments yielded outsized human benefit, those would need to be sourced through archival research rather than invented. What remains striking is how ordinary gestures, listening, adjusting a lamp, issuing a blanket, translated into restoration. The women did not return to full freedom overnight, nor did the camp transform into a comfortable place. But the nights changed, and in those changed nights bodies were allowed to do their quiet work of repair. The major's decision was not a speech. It was a set of orders that reduced disturbance. The interpreter's role was not heroic in the dramatic sense. It was the patient rendering of complaint into cause. The corporal who noticed the swaying at roll call and the private who later put his impression into a letter both performed small tasks of attention that mattered. There is a lesson in the modesty of these actions. When institutions move, they often do so in increments. The history worth remembering is not only the list of battles and treaties, but also the ways in which armies and administrations tended, or failed to tend, to the basic human needs of those under their control. In this case, a simple complaint became an index of changing authority and a test of whether that authority would be exercised with a measure of human decency. It was not inevitable that anyone would listen. That someone did and that the listening turned into specific, effective steps is what makes this an unbelievable story, only in the sense that small mercies in wartime are often overlooked. The image that tends to linger is small and domestic. A curtain pulled across a wooden window, softening the glare. A woman finally lying still after months of half-sleep. A guard pausing in his rounds to make sure that the hum outside slows. These are not the scenes of history that commandeer textbooks, but they are the moments that altered a day, a night, a body. They remind us that power and care can be interwoven in the most ordinary of actions, and that listening, translating a complaint into data and data into intervention, can be a form of authority exercised without fanfare. This is one of the unbelievable episodes from Allied POW camps in late 1944. A small story, recorded in the margins of military administration, that reveals how practical action restored a basic human need. It asks us, as listeners now, to consider the ways authority is used and to remember that the smallest measures of compassion often arrive not as proclamations but as competent adjustments. If a single complaint, "We cannot sleep," could shift the nightly life of a camp, the episode suggests that human dignity in wartime is, more often than not, preserved by attention and modest competence rather than by grand gestures. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what small act of care surprised you most.